5, 6, 7, 8.
Hi EXers, welcome to the EX podcast episode number 45. This is your host, Stefan Vincent. I've started this podcast because I believe that companies have to think of themselves as employment brands if they hope to attract and retain talents. This podcast brings a different lens to the employee experience, a brand and customer experience perspective rather than a traditional HR perspective. Our guests, all thought leaders and disruptors in the EX space in their own way, come to this show to debate, discuss, and share best practices on the key components that foster employee engagements and strengthen company culture, and also to spark the conversation on how to create positive employee experiences. One size doesn't fit all. What Airbnb or Google do around the employee experience may not be applicable in a smaller company. This is what this show is all about, sharing stories of companies of all sizes, not only to show that EX doesn't require a large budget or large team, but also that there isn't one recipe. Each company can find its own way through the EX journey. Today's guest is Beth Giglio, Senior Vice President of Human Resources at 8451. 8451 has developed an expertise in leveraging customer data to drive sales and build brand loyalty. Last year, the company embarked on an EX journey to apply customer experience principles to the EX side. Today with Beth, we will talk about how 8451 is using their customer-centric approach internally to better understand their employees, what types of decisions are being driven by gleaned insights, how knowing your employees better impact your business, and how to measure the success of an employee experience strategy. This episode is brought to you by Fusion Alliance. Fusion Alliance delivers holistic solutions fusing together data, digital, and technology to redefine customer experiences and move your ideas to execution. That's why businesses across multiple industries have relied on Fusion's expertise and partnership for over 25 years. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Beth. If you get a chance, please make sure to review the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, or YouTube. And last thing, if you want to send me feedback, suggestions for future topics or guests, you can reach me at svincent@exsummit.com or on Twitter at ex_summit. All right, let's get to it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the EX podcast. Very, very excited for today's guest, Beth Giglio. She's calling from Cincinnati, and she is the Senior Vice President of Human Resources at 8451. Beth, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely.
To kick it off, tell us a bit more about who you are and what does 8451 does.
Okay. So I lead the human resources team for 8451. I've been here for about just a little over 2 years. I was actually brought in to help reshape some of the HR function and really start to make sure that we were employee-centered and data-driven. So that's why I joined 8451, and that's the role that I play. And for those who don't know 8451, we are actually a wholly owned subsidiary of the Kroger company. And our vision is to help make customers' lives easier by helping retail partners and Kroger develop and nurture customer-driven relationships. We offer kind of a sophisticated suite of tools and technology to navigate the big data landscape and help really illuminate customer patterns. And we believe that if you dig deep enough and look at data longitudinally, the results will follow, helping companies build the bottom line as a result of what they're doing versus the primary objective.
And this is really to be setting the context for our conversation today, because it's going to revolve a lot about what 8451 has been doing, even on the employee side, applying what you guys do for your customers. So my take on the employee experience is really what companies do well on the customer side can and even should be applied to the employee experience side. And as you mentioned, 8451 has developed an expertise in leveraging customer data to drive sales and build brand loyalty. So last year, pretty much at the same time as you started, a bit after you started, the company embarked on an EX journey to apply CX principles to the employee side. So what triggered this initiative?
Yeah, so a little bit of history. This actually started before I joined 8451, but in late 2015, our CEO, Stuart Aitken, he wanted to make sure that we were really driving innovation in the HR arena. And so he actually pulled together a cross-functional team that he called a Tiger team to focus on the talent space. It was actually led by one of our senior analytics leads and staffed with several analysts. HR was represented, but it was actually kind of a minority. So it was starting with what's our process that we use with customers. We start with heavy analytics and try and drive out insights. So they did the same thing on the employee side, and they did a ton of primary research and then started to really collect employee data, both existing as well as creation of new data. And between that work and kind of understanding where we wanted to be long-term and where we were today, this birthed kind of our tool set around tracking employee sentiment on a weekly basis. And that was really kind of our foray into employee experience. So if you think about it from a customer perspective, we have daily sales as a metric. And so we wanted to kind of say, what would that be equivalent on the employee side to really know what our employees were thinking and feeling? And so we created this employee sentiment tool. And that's really where I came in. I joined in early 2016, and I actually took one of the members of that Tiger team, and she joined my group in people analytics. And that's kind of how we got started in this kind of people analytics EX kind of space.
So what process did you go through from the beginning until where you are today?
Well, so like I said, we started with this Tiger team, and then Lauren, who joined us from this kind of Tiger team, has been, on this journey with us for about 2 years. And really, we started with this employee sentiment tool. And so we were trying to understand kind of what data was available to us, where we needed to invest. We also did benchmarking around what other people analytics teams were doing. And then the other key component for us was we also talked to our customer CX team. So we have a customer experience team here, and we said, how did they build out segmentation? How did they do road mapping? Like, what are some of those things? And can we leapfrog to where we are on the customer loyalty side, or do we need to start from the basics? And so that's where we kind of got started, and we decided to work on a couple of different things. So we've done some preliminary work on employee experiences and employee journeys, but we decided to kind of keep going down the path of, like, how do we define employee loyalty first? Because we can map out all of the journeys and understand where the pain points are. But for us, part of, figuring out what keeps employees over time was we're actually going to start with our current employee base and understand employee loyalty. So that's where we, kind of are now, is really trying to understand that. So we're doing kind of traditional people analytics work where we're doing scorecarding, we're understanding why people are leaving. We have our employee engagement surveys, quick wins, those kinds of things. But on the kind of EX side of things, our first foray into kind of our next evolution of sentiment is really around employee loyalty and understanding why people are staying.
So what kind of data points that you already had access to that you leveraged? You mentioned a employee sentiment tool, employee survey. So could you tell us a bit more about what were the data points that you had access to and what new data you had to create from scratch?
Yeah, so we did have, kind of annual engagement surveys, and, kind of the general take on that is it's helpful, but they tend to be annual in nature. They do have benchmarkable data, those kinds of things. But for us to really get under, kind of what keeps people here and why people leave, we felt like we needed to mine more data. So we added some structure to exit interviews that wasn't here before, because that's absolutely a place that we can mine. I will tell you that we've discussed a lot that saying when you do employee exit interviews right as people are leaving, they're typically not as honest as they are later once there's been some separation. So we are currently evaluating, do we do 6 or 12 month post-exit data interviews, and so we're looking into that because I think that's where the real value is understanding once they've separated what do they miss and what do they not miss, and are they happier than when they left, and those kinds of things. So I really want to go there, and that's one thing we're exploring. So that's a data need that I feel like we haven't solved for yet. The other piece was, like I said, more of this what's an in the moment view of employee feelings and thoughts. So that was the employee sentiment tool. So that was new, and that very much came out of this Tiger team work that said, look, we don't have a way to really understand what's on the hearts and minds of our employees on a regular basis. We get it annually, but that's insufficient. So we introduced this weekly tool. And one of the criteria around this weekly tool is that it needed to be very simple to execute and simple to manage. So literally, it's a one-question survey, more or less. That's how you feeling. And with that, it's a scale of 1 to 10, and we've worked on like what the definitions of those are. But it was very much about like how can we pulse our employees on a regular basis. It is a push survey. It goes out weekly. We have learned over the last 2 years lots of things with the iteration of that survey in terms of, we'll see spikes where people are really happy or really not so great, and then we can actually react in the moment. So in terms of how it's affected us, what I would say is we're much more responsive to shifts in the business, and how it affects the HR is probably more in terms of we have a better, almost a feel of different groups. So we know what might cause surges in this group, or let's just say we have an organizational decision. Maybe it's an announcement about bonus, or maybe it's an announcement about something Kroger is doing, or let's say it's an announcement about changes in something that we're doing from a policy. We see instantly the feel in the organization. And what that allows us to do is actually react quickly. And so if somebody is not doing well, even in a new leader position, we see that, and then we can go back and invest the right conversations and, of course, correct. And that also, we use that data. And then the other data point that was added after the Tiger team is we have all company meetings, and we do a survey immediately following that, which is not a typical survey. Typically it would be like, please rate this speaker, and was it relevant? It's more the spirit of, was it worth your time? And if it wasn't worth your time, why? And so that's enabled us to also improve kind of a main communication channel for us. So we have some unique data sets that maybe other companies don't, this weekly pulse being one, and the results of that pulse go to all of our senior leaders. Originally, it was on a weekly basis. Now we've moved to it's a monthly report out just so that we can have more aggregated data. So I'll pause there because I talked a lot about it, but you can ask more specific questions if you want.
No, do you use an app for the survey, or is it just an email survey?
Yeah, we've actually kind of gone through a couple different platforms. We're now using Qualtrics, which was, again, we try and leverage everything from a company perspective. So that's a platform that we use for all our primary research with Kroger customers. And so it's just a natural way to adopt another license and use it in a different way. And it really helps us mine the data in a very easy way.
What is the response rate from employees to the survey?
So it varies, but we have, over the 2 years, we feel really good from a response rate perspective. So anywhere from 30 to 60 people each week go, and it's differently, like I said, as announcements kind of come in or not, they'll spike. What we know to be true is that it's not the same people. And so we've done all the analytics to say it actually is fairly representative. We get different functions represented, different levels represented, and over time, we've touched more than 500 or 600 people in terms of different responses. So people do participate. We have iterated a couple of times to keep it fresh. So, like just changing the platform caused a surge, right, and more participation because people wanted to test it out. We have follow-up questions that sometimes we want to pulse on, so we'll introduce a new question, and that will cause a surge. So some of it we can control, but in general, like the pacing and if you look at our control charts, they've remained pretty constant the whole time.
So you said that it allowed you to change a little bit the way you manage and you see the HR function. Can you expand a bit on this, and what are the drastic changes that you've seen in the function?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I would say there's a ton of drastic changes within HR. What I would say is maybe the way we operate is a little bit differently. So, for example, the HR team also, at our senior HR business partners, get copies of the sentiment results as well. So if there is a potential problem area, we instantly can partner with the leader or leaders of those groups to go and tackle it. So we had one situation where we, were implementing a new way of working in one of our functions, and it wasn't being received well. There were just lots of changes, and people weren't clear on the why and what it meant, and people didn't feel like their voices were heard. And so we started to see that sentiment pop every week. And so for a period of 2 to 3 weeks, we're like, wow, this is really becoming a major issue. So we could then sit down with the leaders, decide what the response was going to be. They called an all-hands meeting. They talked about, we've heard you. Here's what we're doing about it. And then on top of that says, we're going to stay tight with this. And so then they created very specific questions for that function, still using the same platform, but it went directly to them, asking for their feedback over time, so we could immediately manage through that transition. So the difference for me in an HR capacity is, again, we would normally operate that way, but it would be on an annual cycle. And then we do big action plans, and then, we'd figure out what we're going to do. We still do that, but we have so much more context of this weekly kind of view to amplify, in some cases, what gaps might be that would come out annually, but more importantly, it's to respond to them in a more real-time kind of way. So I just think the HR team is more effective because of that, and this data also helps us support leaders in a different way. The same thing on the leader side, but I would say I've seen more change on is from a leadership perspective. The leaders read the comments, and they'll come back and ask, can you give me more clarity here so I want to do this? Or, we give recommended actions when we publish the report, and then it might say, make sure you're having conversations around why you're making your changes. So it just gives us a way to better coach the leaders, and then the leaders themselves understand what they're doing and how it's affecting the organization. So I wouldn't say drastic, but certainly a more informed and more effective HR response to potentially issues and concerns in the business.
So that means you're able to measure the actions that occur after you share those results with the managers?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So I'll give you a really good example. This is not in the sentiment tool, but a different way. So I mentioned that we measure our all-company meeting. Right before I started, the senior team rolled out the strategy, and this was probably a year and a half into the entity of 8451, since we were a spin out from a different company and we were bought by Kroger. But so lots of change. And the CEO gave a really strong message of, here's our strategy for the coming year. Immediately following that, we do the survey on the effectiveness of the meeting. And there was just all this noise. People didn't really understand what people were talking about. And it wasn't clear. And, the CEO and the leadership team was like, we didn't do a great job with that. What are we going to do differently? And so literally a month later, which was our next kind of all corporate company meeting, they said, look, we got your feedback. This wasn't clear. So we're going to try it again, and we're going to try it in a different way. We're going to see if this resonates better. Most companies would never be able to do that, both to hear the feedback, but also to respond to it in such a tight, timely way. And those are the kinds of things that we see, when there are, pockets of concerns or issues, as well as what's positive, right? So we measure the sentiment, so we see how positive the sentiment is and what's driving that as well. So I don't want to make it all about problem solving, but you tend to solve more right, when issues surface versus the good stuff. But we see both sides.
It's a great example because, one of the limits of an annual survey is, first of all, it's once a year, obviously, and it takes time to digest all the information and to be able to assimilate it and define a plan of action to respond to the feedback. And by the time you do this, you get to the point of sharing the feedback. It probably, a month or maybe a couple of months pass by, and you lose some momentum in the process. The nice thing about sentiment polling on a regular basis, on a weekly basis in your case, is that you're able to make small adjustments pretty much right away on the spot as you get feedback from your employees.
Right.
What was some of the challenges that you faced along the way going through that whole initiative, and what are the things that you have learned that you could share with
some of our listeners who may think of doing something similar?
So, a couple of things. This is one where, there wasn't any proven track record. So I think, again, we took on a little bit of our cultural effects here, which is that we're a test and learn company. So as other groups think about it, like you want to try it, right? This is not something that you just suddenly undo. You want to be able to manage through it. So I think the challenge is just thinking through, what if it fails? What if it doesn't work? And like a most important one is you're actually going to react to the data. So if you're not willing to, lean in, like all of our leaders read it, all of our leaders take action around it, right? If you were in an organization that wasn't as data driven, that could be a challenge outside of 8451. Our challenge, I think, and we're still facing it, right, is this concept of confidential, anonymous. Is it truly anonymous? Those kinds of things. And despite all the lengths that we have gone to make sure it truly is anonymous, people still question whether it is or it isn't. And we're constantly trying to explain what we do to maintain confidentiality. Now the challenge is post that decision, right? We're 2 years in and we're on let's say a diversity and inclusion journey. And now I'm trying to figure out, well, how do I mine the data to cut it a little bit differently? Well, it's anonymous. So unless people chose to put their demographics in and have chosen to release some of that stuff, I can't use that data. So I think, again, my advice if you are thinking about this is to really think about what the long-term goals might be, because I really want to make it a confidential survey now so that I can go back and use the data. So I think it wasn't a challenge that we faced in the beginning, but it's a challenge now to kind of say, I have 2 years worth of data. And if I want to get to, let's say, a predictive attrition model, wow, if I could go back and pinpoint people who maybe had lower or more negative sentiment, have they left the company? Have they not left the company? So that's what we're kind of trialing now to figure out, like, how do we use this data in a more predictive way? So again, wasn't a challenge at the time, but certainly the challenge is now. I think for a lot of other organizations, the other component would be we were doing it weekly. So I had somebody who joined my team, so we added headcount to my team around people analytics. I think you have to have somebody who can do that work because she's mining, she's reading through and assessing sentiment from the comments because there are open-ended comments on it as well. And then she's packaging that data with our annual survey data. She's mining all of that. So having a skill set that can do that work is really helpful. In HR, historically, right, you don't necessarily have that heavy analytical skill set. And right. So there was a choice for me of, do I bring in a PhD OD type, IO psych person, or do I bring somebody from the business? And I debated that for a while. So that was a challenge here. Like, what do I do? What's the best route? And we decided to go ahead, and because the sentiment tool was just getting off the ground and because our DNA is data and analytics, I took a risk and just said, maybe I can teach the HR components, but I can't teach the analytics. And so that's been kind of a challenge just transitioning into HR. And, some of her peers don't have the analytical prowess. And then she was an analyst in the core business versus HR. So we've just had some transition stuff, but I think those are unique to the choices we've made versus necessarily a complete, comparable to other people who might be listening.
So we talked about data confidentiality, and obviously it's a concern. Now, so obviously most of the data is aggregated, right? It's anonymous data.
Correct.
So it's probably even way too early in the process for you to be able to answer that question. But do you see in the long term that companies will be able to somehow personalize experiences based on different employee groups the same way they personalize experiences based on different customer segments?
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of our latest foray. So this was just kind of us getting our feet wet in the basics around people analytics and then trying to find a better, understanding of our current employee base. But right now, I think the best segmentation we can do is by function. But we just embarked last fall, again, trying to look at CX, as kind of a reference point. And, within marketing and customer experience, that's exactly what they do. They try and understand different segments of the customer population so that you can better personalize marketing, you can better personalize the solution sets, targeting of emails, whatever it might be. So that's where we want to get to. And so we went through a process last fall to say, how might we understand what those segments might look like? So again, my analyst partnered up with our primary research team to start to look at how we would better understand why people stay at 8451. And again, this is where our employee sentiment tool was helpful. She did a ton of primary research, but then she also looked at common themes over the last 2 years that, led to positive or negative sentiment to kind of say these may be important to understand. And so we did a survey in the November, December timeframe of last year to understand against a number of different factors what's important to our people on a relative basis. So I'll give you a couple examples. So the importance of having a manager you trust versus, let's say, an on-site workout facility. So we took both kind of tangible and intangible things, had people rate them, in buckets. So you might have 5 things that you're comparing, and you'd have to put what was most important to you of that 5. And then you churn through a total of, I think we had between 60 and 80 different attributes. So it was a long survey. But the end of that survey, what you get is across our entire population that took it, what's most important to some and least important to others, and what's most important to everyone. And so we now have a base understanding of what's common to everyone. And then we also have groups that are in segments that we're just starting to dig into to kind of say, what are the differences? And so we see things where people might value, let's say, time off and benefits and work-life balance and offerings, stock purchase, et cetera, that are really, really important to some groups, while other things, it's all around the work. The challenges, the intellectual learning, who they get to work with, the fact that they may be independent while they're working, whatever those things might be. And then there was a third kind of group that we started to look at that, might be more relationship driven. And so we're just starting to mine all that data, but the intent is then to say, when we look at benefits, when we look at HR solutions, when we look at company cultural changes, how might that affect any of these different groups? So we're just getting there, and then starting to then also think through not only how do you personalize solutions, but personalized career paths, right? Because they're motivated by different places in their life, those kinds of things. So it's very early on our journey around segmentation.
Now, clearly, it's pretty uncommon to have data that lives and resides in the HR function. So 8451 is, I would say, probably quite some unique here in that space. But, and it's one of the hardest brands or employer brands or companies to work for in Cincinnati, I would say. So let's switch gear a little bit and talk about the employer branding. Is it something that lives inside your organization, inside the HR function, or is it something that lives in marketing at 8451?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say that's probably an opportunity area for us, is the kind of employment branding as well as value proposition. When we kind of separated from our joint venture relationship with dunnhumby USA and became 8451, we started on a new journey because 8451 didn't have any brand recognition in the marketplace. Right. And so I think we still are working through that from an HR talent perspective. And because of the way things transitioned, quite frankly, anything that was on a website, anything that was externally facing was very basic. And only just recently, have we, added some team members in the marketing side. So to answer your question, it resides in marketing to really start to look at the employee value proposition and all the channels that we're using, and even just how we describe our roles. So we're pretty early on. But again, this work that we're doing actually helps us start to package that even more meaningfully, right, in terms of we know our employees better than anybody else, right? We're trying to really understand so that we can better personalize solutions. It's definitely something we will package at some point, but we're pretty early in understanding what is that employee value proposition for our folks. The segmentation is helping us know that for sure.
Right. So the same way that you have a data analyst on your team, do you see someone moving into your team that would handle and manage the employee branding?
I don't know. We have a pretty strong marketing group at this point. I think it's more, again, I'm a big leverager. I don't need to own it. I probably would be more inclined to say, you spend time with our recruiters. You spend time with the data miners of our group. You spend time culturally with the organization and tell me what you're hearing, and then we package it together, which is how it's been working so far. I think that's where we are. I think what we'll know more of over time is the insights, right, of how that value proposition is working, which is exactly the role we play with Kroger, right? We're an insights company that provides insight to action. So I would say they're going to give us insights somewhat on how many hits to the site, what's resonating, right, those kinds of things. But we're going to give insights as to what our employees are telling us and how that evolves over time as to what's important to them. And then we can provide that back to them. But at this point, I don't see me taking on branding or the value proposition as much as helping to shape it.
Do you oversee talent acquisition, or is it separate from HR?
No, I have end-to-end HR accountability. So I have talent acquisition, I have talent development and learning and development. I have our HR ops back office function, and then I have the HR business partners as well.
So do you leverage data on the recruiting talent acquisition side as well?
So we do have data over the years where we use a heavy develop from within approach to talent. So we have been able to mine, historically, how does talent come from different schools or different programs? At this point, we're in the middle of changing out our applicant tracking system, which will give us more data than we've had before. So that's one of our analysts' next adventures, if you will, to really better mine that data. But right now it's more historical. We just know, what schools, what programs, and kind of how talent is moved. And then we actually have kind of a little bit of a consulting group inside our business, and they've added some resources from a functional perspective, and they've done some data mining as well in terms of where we have external hires, what some of the patterns they're seeing at, early grade level entry versus later, and success patterns of what makes them successful. So we are doing that data mining in a couple different places.
How many employees do you have at 8451?
We're running about 760-ish right now. Changes every day, though. We're a growth company, so.
Are they all based in Cincinnati, or do you have remote workers?
Great question. So we have, I would say, a heavy concentration is based here in Cincinnati because we're co-located with our corporate headquarters of Kroger. But we actually have offices in Chicago and in Deerfield, Illinois. So downtown Chicago and then Deerfield, Illinois. And then we also have a small remote office in New York. And then an office that has a couple of folks in Portland, which is aligned to Fred Meyer, which is one of the family of companies of Kroger that we've historically supported. So we go ahead and co-locate people out there on rotations or whatnot. And then we do have people who work virtually. It just depends on the role and kind of where they live and what they need to do from a personal and professional perspective.
So what's the ratio, roughly, of remote versus in-office?
I don't know that I know that off the top of my head, but I can say the vast majority work in an office setting. We have, a handful, probably I would say under 50 who work remotely.
So you talked a bit earlier about diversity and inclusion, which is one of your priorities or initiatives for this year. Could you tell us a bit more about how D&I is important to 8451 and what you're working on to address that question?
Yeah, so again, we started from a data perspective around D&I. Mm-hmm. So a couple of different things. We took our leadership off-site to just kind of ground everybody in the concepts of what diversity means, what inclusion means, basics and unconscious bias, some privilege exercises, just to kind of get them in the mindset of why this is important to us. And certainly being an insights-driven company and knowing that unconscious bias exists, and it can exist in algorithm development, it can exist in how you look at data, it became pretty clear what our business case is for change. And so, again, I'm fortunate that I have a good team here from a leadership perspective that get it. And so we then moved from that to establish, we have an Insightful Inclusion Council that's made up of every level, every function, every kind of ethnicity, gender, those kinds of things, because we really wanted to kind of put together a team that in an ideal world, this is what we would look and feel like years from now to help guide us. And over the last, let's say 15 months, that group has started to define what's Nirvana state look like, understand what we would need to do to measure success. And then they actually help partner with a third party to do an inclusion assessment. And so we, last summer, had an assessor come in and help us understand what's the kind of state of affairs in terms of people feeling included. We then rolled out those results, both in a data-driven as well as case study way this fall to our entire organization. And from there, we identified 4 different areas that we wanted to kind of focus on to understand how we can improve. And then we just finished that work in terms of a 3-year roadmap over the last couple of weeks. And now we're in that mode of just aligning all the stakeholders to say what we want to do next. But it was very data-driven in terms of we need to bring forward rich data that says we are or we aren't inclusive and in these areas and why, and then really help people sit in the data through the case studies to understand, where some of our problem areas are. So again, very fortunate that this is a data-driven company. My analysts also got involved in all the, hardcore data that most companies look at. And we're working through, kind of more of the hardcore stuff, be it equity, be it representation, be it, gender at all levels, those kinds of things. So all the normal stuff every company is looking at, we're also looking at, but we're also working a pretty heavy inclusion journey at the same time.
You mentioned earlier development as well that you oversee within the HR function. And professional and personal developments are one of the key drivers for millennials to join and to remain or to stay with the company. Do you do anything special around professional development for your employees?
It's interesting you should ask that, Stefan. We actually came across a tool at a startup kind of event a little over a year and a half ago, I guess. It's called PathGather. It's one of, I believe, 2 or 3 available tools that's called, it's basically a content aggregator. So imagine that every company has some kind of learning management system in place. This actually sits in between the learning management system and the employee by giving you access to both the learning management system, but also all other publicly available content, as well as any paid for content. So, for example, we have Skillsoft. We also have Safari. We have a number of different tools that are proprietary that we have bought into. What this tool called PathGather does is let an employee go on a single search that searches everything that's out in the open web, anything that's internal that's been posted, and then anything that is privately available based on being an employee here. And what that allows us to do is develop paths, develop communities of learning, have postings that people can read. And on the back end, from an HR perspective, it allows us to understand a couple of different things. It allows us to understand who's influencing learning in the organization.
Yes.
It allows us to look at, where there are paths that people can go to. We can actually create corporate paths if we so choose, so we can actually develop the training online, which is some combination of planned, unplanned, and posted content. So it helps with onboarding, right? As well as just being able to drive communities of conversation. So obviously I have a diversity and inclusion path, and everything that I can find around algorithm bias, I can put that out there, and then people have one place to go. But then they can also search and see what else is out there. So it's a nice, very easy to use interface that solves, people going to 5 different things to find learning. And our millennial group is just eating it up right now.
So obviously EX is not a new concept, but it's a concept that is gaining a momentum. Now, one of the most common question I get is, it's fine, EX sounds pretty exciting, but how do you measure the impact on the EX on the company's performance? It's always the tricky question to tie whatever investment is being done in the employee experience to how much value does it bring to the organization, how much revenue does it help generate. Do you have any insights of what's the EX impact on the business performance at 8451?
Yeah, I would say we're still pretty early in our journey.
Right.
Some of the work with the sentiment work, whether you argue that that's EX or not, conceptually, I would say it's very much aligned. because it's a way to understand what the employees are experiencing at any given moment. So I would say from a data set perspective, I would put that in EX, even though it's probably not the basics of, customer journey and employee journey and all those kinds of things. We do learn pain points with that. The fact that that tool has affected immediate change within the business and the business actually wants that data, I think I haven't had to really justify the value yet. Let's say the segmentation work, which is kind of our first journey, I think, which is more of the loyalty and EX real work. I would say people value the work. The decision-making that comes from it is really where we're at right now, which is, okay, so what? So we now have these segments. What are we going to do differently, better, et cetera? So I would say we're in that mode right now. We're a little bit of the honeymoon phase. If people are enamored with, oh, that's really cool that you did that. But then that's like, what outcome are you going to change that's different? And I would say that's where I'm spending a little bit more strategic time to say, we have a highly engaged organization. Am I trying to increase engagement with understanding this or not? So like, what's that outcome variable? So we're working through that. My personal belief is it's about retention, right? Knowing that the generation that's in the workforce and every generation that's coming is going to change jobs so much more frequently than historically. And the gig economy is around the corner, right? It's already here with us. How am I going to ensure that people stay? So everything I'm doing is around acquiring and retaining talent. And so on the recruiting side, as we get more data, I think we'll continue to do improvements in that path. Right now I'm in that retain bucket because I think the risk of talent loss is higher than it's ever been. So that's kind of where I am, and that ultimately will be the measure, right, for us, is if we've preempted retention issues or mitigated them because of us knowing our employees better than anyone else, and therefore better targeting solutions for folks at various stages in their lifestyle.
That makes a lot of sense. Now we're getting close to the end, so let me, before we wrap it up, let me ask you some fun questions so that our audience can get to know you a bit more intimately, I would say. Mm-hmm. If you were to invite someone famous to dinner, who would you choose and why?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I really had to think on this one. The person that I picked was Clara Barton, and part of it may be all the work that I'm doing in diversity and inclusion right now. But given the time period with which she was, a leader, for her to be able to establish the Red Cross and the momentum that she had to do that, I can only imagine some of the struggles she might have faced during that time period as a female leader. And I would just love the opportunity to have dinner with her so I could hear her story and how she navigated everything from the politics to the why to the how did she get investors, just to learn more, because ultimately I got to believe she was an enormously resilient individual, and I'd want to learn from her resilience.
So let's stay on the same topic a little bit, but what is your personal motto or your driver?
Yeah, not quite related to hers, although I think it resembles it a little bit, is from the time that I've been a little girl, it was always about leaving things better than the way that you found them. I got that a little bit from Brownies and Girl Scouts, but then I was in 4-H as well. And then my grandfather was actually a state representative for the state of Ohio for more than 16 years. Oh. And he had a profound effect on me of, your role in life is to help improve the environment that you're in for others. And so I still firmly believe that. It's probably why I ended up in consulting. It's probably why I'm in HR. It's one of the things that I just believe that I should help the environment and the community that I'm in be better, and people too.
So something completely different. What could we spot you doing outside of work that would maybe flabbergast your coworkers?
Flabbergast my coworkers. Let's see. Probably that I'm actually very passive on the weekends, to be honest. So I tend to keep a schedule that's very, very tight at work. I work a ton. I love what I do. And so when I'm, not at work, I'm about chilling with the kids, watching American Idol, just kind of really not doing anything much at all. So I think that would flabbergast people that says I actually sit down and just be on weekends.
If you were the last woman on Earth, what would you do?
If I was the last woman on Earth, what would I do? So what the question was?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I'd have to think about that one a little bit. Is there anybody else with me? Or I'm just the only person on Earth?
I mean, I assume, I don't know if you watch the show The Last Man on Earth, but eventually you may end up finding other human beings. But at least for the first couple of days, what would you do?
I would probably be planning something. I would be sad for a while, and then be like, all right, pick your bootstraps up and figure out what you're going to do. You're either going to, go figure out how to procreate independently, to create people, because I'm definitely a social creature at nature, and at heart, or, I'd be figuring out, shelter, water, sustainability. I would be planning something. If you talk to my husband, he would say she'd pull out her spreadsheet and figure out a plan. So that's probably what I would do.
Okay. Spreadsheet. Interesting. What is the way for our listeners to follow you and 8451 on social media?
So definitely check out our LinkedIn, site. You can find me on LinkedIn as Beth Giglio. You can also find 8451.com, for anything about the company, and then certainly on social media as well.
And we'll share those on our notes on the website. Any last word of advice or wisdom?
I would just say this space is so unique. It's a really awesome way for HR professionals to partner with different functions in the organization, bring in different kinds of thinking. So I think upon reflection, made a really good decision about bringing in an analyst as opposed to necessarily doing it the traditional way, because she thinks about the business very differently, right? Mm-hmm. She's not encumbered with traditional HR stuff. And so she looks at everything with kind of a very objective point of view. So it's kind of a unique position. And so I would just encourage people to take some risks. The only thing that's a risk in my mind is not doing anything if you collect the data. But not collecting the data in this world, to me, puts HR organizations behind. You have to know more than the traditional annual survey in order to really operate successfully, strategically as an HR organization. So jump in and get going. That would be my thoughts.
Great way to wrap it up for today. Well, thank you so much, Beth. I really enjoyed speaking with you and sharing your insights on how 8451 is leading the employee data-driven space.
You're welcome. It was a great pleasure. It's always good to work with you.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the EX Podcast. If you want to learn more, visit our website at expodcast.com. If you want to find out more about our next conferences, go to exsummit.com. Finally, you can also find my manifesto on business to employee or B2E branding at b2ebranding.co. See you next week.